Marcus Johnson stood in the busy terminal of O'Hare International Airport, his shoulders tense despite his attempt to appear casual. After 18 months of deep undercover work with a Colombian drug cartel, he was finally back on American soil. The mission had been successful. He had gathered enough evidence to take down 3 major players in the organization. Now, all he wanted was to get home, take a long shower, and sleep in his own bed. At 34, Marcus had spent nearly a decade with the DEA. His dark skin and fluent Spanish made him valuable for undercover operations in Latin America. Though the work was dangerous, he believed in what he did. Today, dressed in jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and carrying a weathered backpack, he looked like any other traveler. Officer Richard Daniels watched from near the security checkpoint. He had been with the airport police for 15 years and had his own system for picking out drug mules. Daniels nudged his partner. "See that guy? Black male, mid-30s, traveling alone from Colombia. Bet he's carrying." His partner frowned. "You got a tip?" "Don't need one, I can just tell," Daniels said, already moving toward Marcus. Marcus noticed the officer approaching. Years of training had sharpened his awareness of law enforcement, even when he was one of them. Something about the officer's walk, confident, almost eager, made Marcus uneasy. "Sir, I need you to step aside for additional screening," Daniels said loudly, one hand resting on his holster. Several travelers turned to look. Marcus felt the weight of their stares and the familiar burn of being singled out. Still, he kept his face calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Just routine. This way, please." Daniels gripped Marcus's arm tightly, steering him toward a small room off the main terminal. Inside the room, Daniels ordered Marcus to place his backpack on the table. 2 other officers stood by the door, watching silently. "I'm going to search your bag now. Any reason I should be concerned?" Daniels asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "No, sir, just clothes and toiletries," Marcus replied. As Daniels searched, Marcus noticed how the officer's body blocked the security camera's view of the bag. With quick, practiced movements, Daniels slipped his hand into his own pocket, then into a side compartment of Marcus's backpack. Marcus saw it happen but kept his face neutral. His heart rate stayed steady, a skill learned through years of dangerous undercover work. He knew exactly what was happening. He was being framed. Well, what do we have here?" Daniels pulled out a small plastic bag of white powder. He held it up with a satisfied smile. "Looks like cocaine to me." "That's not mine," Marcus said calmly. "I've never seen that before." Daniels laughed. "They all say that. Turn around, hands behind your back." As the cold metal of handcuffs closed around his wrists, Marcus weighed his options. He could reveal his identity now, show his DEA credentials that were hidden in a secret compartment of his watch. That would end this quickly. But something stopped him. The ease with which Daniels had planted the drugs suggested this wasn't his first time. How many innocent people had been arrested this way? How many lives had been ruined by this man's actions? "You have the right to remain silent," Daniels began, reciting the Miranda rights with practiced ease. Marcus decided to stay quiet. He would remain undercover just a little longer. Perhaps this unexpected turn of events could lead to something bigger, a chance to expose corruption from the inside. As they led him through the terminal in handcuffs, Marcus caught the pitying and judgmental glances of other travelers. For now, he would play the role of another black man wrongfully accused. But unlike those before him, Marcus Johnson had the power to fight back. The small interrogation room smelled of bleach and sweat. Marcus sat in an uncomfortable metal chair, his wrists still cuffed, though now in front of him. Officer Daniels had left him alone for 45 minutes, a common tactic to increase anxiety in suspects. But Marcus used this time to think, to plan. The door swung open, and Daniels entered with another officer, a younger man with a nervous expression. Daniels carried Marcus's backpack and placed it on the table between them. "Let's go through this again, shall we?" Daniels pulled on blue latex gloves with a snap. "I find it interesting that a man traveling from Colombia just happens to have 20 grams of cocaine hidden in his bag." Marcus kept his face neutral. "Like I said, that's not mine. I've never seen it before." "Right." Daniels rolled his eyes. "And I suppose you're going to tell me you were in Colombia for vacation?" "Business," Marcus said simply. What kind of business? Import consulting. This was his cover story, and it had the benefit of being partially true. Marcus had indeed been consulting on imports, specifically how to track illegal drug shipments moving through legitimate businesses. While Daniels continued questioning him, Marcus watched the younger officer. The man seemed uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to another, avoiding eye contact. Not everyone was comfortable with Daniels' methods, it seemed. "Officer Reed," Daniels said to the younger man, "would you grab Mr. Johnson's file from the front desk?" When Reed left the room, Daniels' demeanor changed. The fake smile disappeared. He leaned forward, his voice low and threatening. "Listen, I don't know what your game is, but I've been doing this long enough to spot guys like you the moment they step off the plane. Black guy, nice clothes, coming from Colombia. You might as well have worn a sign." Marcus remained silent, but his mind was racing. This wasn't just casual racism. Daniels seemed to have a system, targeting specific travelers who fit a profile. How many innocent people had been caught in this net? Daniels began emptying Marcus's backpack item by item, making a show of examining each thing. When he reached the bottom, he frowned and felt around the lining. With a dramatic flourish, he pulled out another small bag of white powder from a seam that Marcus knew for certain had not been there before. "Well, what do we have here? More cocaine?" Daniels smiled triumphantly. "That's another 40 grams. We're looking at serious trafficking charges now." Marcus knew what was happening. Daniels was building a bigger case. More drugs meant longer sentences and likely a plea deal. This was about statistics, about career advancement built on the backs of false arrests. Officer Reed returned with a folder, his eyes widening at the new evidence on the table. "Sir, Officer Reed, please document this additional contraband," Daniels instructed. "Mr. Johnson here is going to be our guest for quite some time." As Reed photographed the evidence, his hands shook slightly. Marcus caught his eye for a brief moment and saw something, doubt, perhaps, or guilt. Daniels continued his monologue, explaining in detail the charges Marcus would face and the minimum sentences for drug trafficking. 20 years minimum. Unless, of course, you have something to offer us. Names, contacts. Information has value in our system. Marcus knew the game. Daniels was fishing, hoping for a desperate confession or for Marcus to implicate others to save himself. It was a tactic that worked on scared, innocent people who would say anything to avoid decades in prison. But Marcus wasn't scared. Behind his calm exterior, anger was building, not for himself, but for everyone who had sat in this chair before him without the protection his federal badge could provide. "I want a lawyer," Marcus finally said, invoking the right that would temporarily halt this interrogation. Daniels' smile faltered slightly. "Lawyer up if you want. Makes no difference to me. The evidence speaks for itself." As Daniels gathered the bags of planted cocaine, Marcus made a decision. He wouldn't reveal his identity yet. There was something bigger here, a pattern of abuse that needed to be exposed. Sometimes, the best way to catch a predator was to play the role of prey. 4 hours had passed since Marcus's detention began. He now sat in a holding cell at the airport police station, a small concrete room with a bench and nothing else. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the floor. His request for a lawyer had been acknowledged, but Officer Daniels had made it clear that at this hour, it might be some time before one arrived. Marcus closed his eyes and leaned his head against the cool wall. His DEA training had prepared him for situations far worse than this, but the humiliation of being framed stirred something deep inside him. He thought of his father's warnings from childhood. "Keep your head down, son. Some cops aren't looking for the truth, they're looking for someone to blame." The cell door opened with a metallic clang. Officer Reed stood there, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Johnson, I need to take your fingerprints now," he said, avoiding direct eye contact. Marcus stood up and followed Reed to a small processing room. As Reed pressed each of Marcus's fingers onto the digital scanner, Marcus noticed the young officer's hands were slightly clammy. "How long have you worked with Officer Daniels?" Marcus asked casually. Reed hesitated. "About 8 months." "You like working with him?" Reed's eyes darted to the door, checking if anyone was listening. "I don't think we should be talking, sir." Marcus nodded and let it drop. The officer's reaction told him plenty. Reed wasn't comfortable with what was happening, but he wasn't ready to speak up either. After fingerprinting, Reed escorted Marcus back to his cell. Before leaving, Reed paused. "A lawyer should be here in the morning," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry about the wait." The door closed, and Marcus was alone again. He sat down and thought carefully about his next move. His DEA identification was hidden in a special compartment in the heel of his boot, standard procedure for deep cover assignments. The officers hadn't discovered it during their search. One word from him, and this whole situation would end immediately. But something kept him from revealing his identity. Maybe it was the practiced way Daniels had planted the drugs, or the resigned look in Reed's eyes, as if this was routine. If Marcus exposed himself now, Daniels would face some consequences, but the system that allowed him to operate would remain intact. Around midnight, the cell door opened again. This time, it was Officer Daniels, holding a cup of coffee and wearing a satisfied smile. "Comfortable, Johnson?" he asked, taking a sip from his cup. "You should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a big day for you. Arraignment, formal charges, the works." Marcus sat up straight. "Those drugs weren't mine." "That's not what the evidence says," Daniels replied. "You know, this could go easier for you. I've got connections with the DA's office. You help us find bigger fish, maybe your charges get reduced." Marcus recognized the technique, offering hope to extract information, whether the suspect was guilty or not. "What exactly do you want from me?" Marcus asked, playing along. Daniels smiled wider. "Names, contacts. Who are you working for? Nobody carries that quality of product without being connected." In that moment, Marcus understood that Daniels wasn't just a racist cop looking to boost his arrest numbers. He was fishing for information about drug networks, information a regular officer shouldn't care about. "And if I had those names," Marcus said carefully, "what happens then?" Daniels leaned against the door frame. "Then maybe some of that evidence disappears. Maybe instead of 20 years, you're looking at probation. Happens all the time." The pieces were falling into place. Daniels wasn't just planting drugs. He was using his position to gather intelligence on drug traffickers. The question was, for what purpose? "I'll think about it," Marcus said. "Don't think too long," Daniels replied, finishing his coffee. "Offer expires when that lawyer of yours shows up." As Daniels walked away, Marcus felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about one corrupt cop anymore. There was something much bigger happening here, and perhaps his accidental detention was the key to uncovering it all. Morning light filtered through the small window of the holding cell. Marcus had barely slept, his mind working through different scenarios and possibilities. He heard footsteps approaching and sat up just as the cell door opened. Officer Reed stood there with a woman in a gray suit. "Your lawyer is here," Reed said, stepping aside. The woman entered the cell with confident steps. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Sandra Reeves. I've been assigned to your case." Marcus nodded. "Thank you for coming." Reed left them alone, closing the door but remaining visible through the small window. Sandra sat beside Marcus and opened her briefcase. "They've charged you with possession with intent to distribute. The amount they found carries a minimum sentence of 10 years. I need to know your side of the story." Marcus studied her face. She seemed genuine, tired eyes, no-nonsense expression, worn briefcase. A public defender who had seen it all. "I was framed," Marcus said simply. "Officer Daniels planted those drugs in my bag." Sandra didn't look surprised. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth." She sighed. "Mr. Johnson, I should tell you that Officer Daniels has a perfect record with drug arrests. Every single case has led to a conviction." "Because he's planting evidence," Marcus said, keeping his voice low. Sandra leaned closer. "Between us, there have been complaints about Daniels before. Nothing that stuck. But if what you're saying is true, we need evidence." Marcus thought for a moment. "The airport has security cameras. They would have recorded him searching my bag." "I'll request that footage immediately," Sandra made a note. "But I should warn you, these recordings have a way of disappearing when officers like Daniels are involved." Their conversation was interrupted when the cell door opened again. Officer Daniels walked in, followed by a man in an expensive suit. "Time's up, counselor," Daniels said to Sandra. Mr. Johnson is being transferred downtown for arraignment. The man in the suit stepped forward. Actually, there's been a change of plans. He handed Sandra an official-looking document. I'm Special Agent Thomas Wilson, FBI. We're taking jurisdiction of this case. Marcus kept his expression neutral, but inside, his mind raced. The FBI. This wasn't part of any protocol he knew. His DEA supervisors should have been the ones to intervene if his cover was compromised. Sandra reviewed the papers, frowning. This is highly unusual. National security trumps the drug charge, Wilson said smoothly. He turned to Daniels. Officer, I'll need a moment alone with the prisoner. Daniels looked furious. This is my arrest. And now it's my case, Wilson replied firmly. After a tense moment, Daniels stormed out. Sandra looked at Marcus with concern. Mr. Johnson, do you want me to stay? Marcus nodded slightly. Something didn't feel right. Once they were alone, Wilson's friendly demeanor vanished. He sat across from Marcus and spoke quietly. Agent Johnson, we need to talk. Marcus kept his face blank. I don't know what you're talking about. Wilson smiled thinly. Drop the act. We know you're DA. What we don't know is why you haven't identified yourself. Marcus studied Wilson carefully. The man's credentials looked real, but something was off. If you know who I am, then you know my handler. Call him, Marcus challenged. Wilson's smile didn't waver. That won't be necessary. What's necessary is understanding why a DEA agent is carrying cocaine. And there it was, the trap. If Marcus acknowledged he was DEA, he'd be admitting the drugs were his. If he maintained his cover, he faced charges as a civilian. Sandra looked between them, confused. What's going on here? Marcus made a quick decision. Ms. Reeves, I'd like to continue with you as my attorney. I don't recognize this man, and I don't believe he's FBI. Wilson's eyes hardened. That's a mistake, Johnson. My only mistake was getting searched by a dirty cop, Marcus replied calmly. Wilson stood up. Have it your way. He walked to the door and knocked for the guard. As Wilson left, Sandra turned to Marcus with wide eyes. Are you really DEA? Marcus leaned close to her ear. I can't confirm or deny that, but I can tell you there's something very wrong happening in this airport, and I think your client just became the key to exposing it all. For the first time since his arrest, Marcus felt he might have found an ally in this increasingly dangerous game. The courthouse holding cell was even smaller than the one at the airport. Marcus sat on a metal bench, waiting for his arraignment. Sandra had gone to file motions for the security footage and to request an investigation into Wilson's credentials. The supposed FBI agent had disappeared as quickly as he had arrived, leaving more questions than answers. The door opened and Officer Reed stepped in, looking nervous. 5 minutes until your hearing, he said, not meeting Marcus's eyes. Officer Reed, Marcus said quietly, something's not right about all this. Reed glanced over his shoulder, then back at Marcus. Look, I'm just doing my job. Is planting evidence part of that job? Reed's face paled. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. Marcus leaned forward. I saw Daniels put those drugs in my bag, and I'm guessing it's not the first time. Reed's hands trembled slightly. You don't understand. It's complicated. Help me understand then. The young officer seemed to be fighting an internal battle. Finally, he whispered, Daniels has connections. Powerful ones. People who've made it clear that looking the other way is healthier than asking questions. Connections to who? Marcus pressed. Before Reed could answer, the door swung open. Daniels stood there, eyes narrowing at the scene. What's going on here? He demanded. Just checking if the prisoner needs anything before court, Reed said quickly. Daniels snorted. He'll need a miracle. He turned to Marcus. Judge Crawford doesn't look kindly on drug traffickers, especially ones who try to claim police misconduct. As Reed led Marcus out of the holding cell toward the courtroom, a commotion erupted in the hallway. 2 men in suits pushed past the courthouse security, flashing badges. DEA, everyone stand down, the taller man shouted. Marcus recognized his handler, Special Agent Carlos Ramirez, accompanied by another agent he didn't know. Relief washed over him, but he kept his expression neutral. Daniels stepped forward, anger flashing across his face. What the hell is this? Ramirez approached Daniels directly. Officer Daniels, I'm placing you under temporary detention while we sort this situation out. On what grounds? Daniels demanded, his hand moving toward his weapon. Interfering with a federal investigation, Ramirez said coldly, and I strongly suggest you move that hand away from your gun. The second DEA agent stepped forward and addressed Marcus. Agent Johnson, are you all right? For the first time since his arrest, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Better now, Phillips. The courthouse erupted into confused activity. Reed stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock. Sandra pushed through the crowd, legal papers still in her hand. What's happening? She asked Marcus. The truth is coming out, Marcus replied. Ramirez pulled Marcus aside while Phillips dealt with a furious Daniels. What happened? You were supposed to check in yesterday. When you didn't, we traced your phone to the airport detention center. Daniels happened, Marcus explained quickly. He planted drugs in my bag and was trying to pressure me for information about drug networks. But something bigger is going on. He has connections, and there was a man claiming to be FBI who tried to take over the case. Ramirez's expression darkened. We've been tracking complaints against Daniels for months. Several travelers with similar profiles to yours have been arrested. The cases were always airtight, perfect evidence, perfect arrests. Too perfect, Marcus said. Exactly. Ramirez glanced at Daniels, who was now sitting handcuffed on a bench, rage evident on his face. We think he's working with someone to identify actual drug mules coming through the airport. Not to arrest them, Marcus realized. To shake them down for information or money. Or to eliminate competition, Ramirez added. The question is, who's he working for? Officer Reed approached them hesitantly. Agent Johnson? I want to help. Marcus looked at the young officer, seeing fear, but also determination in his eyes. I know things, Reed continued. About Daniels, about the operation. I've wanted to come forward, but you were afraid. Marcus finished for him. I understand. Now's your chance to make it right. As Reed began to talk, Marcus felt the pieces coming together. What had started as a simple frame-up was unraveling into something much larger, a conspiracy that reached beyond one racist cop and into the heart of drug trafficking operations using O'Hare as their gateway. The DEA field office buzzed with activity. 3 hours had passed since Marcus's release from custody, and now he sat in a conference room with Ramirez, Phillips, and 2 other senior agents. Officer Reed waited nervously in another room, having agreed to provide official testimony against Daniels. So what's the play? Marcus asked, now dressed in fresh clothes, his DEA badge visible on his belt. The transformation from suspect to federal agent had been swift, but the anger at his treatment still simmered beneath the surface. Ramirez spread photos across the table. Reed gave us enough to start connecting the dots. Daniels isn't just a dirty cop with racist tendencies. He's part of an organized operation. The photos showed Daniels meeting with different men at various locations around Chicago. One face appeared multiple times, a well-dressed man in his 50s. Victor Reyes, Phillips explained. He runs several legitimate businesses in Chicago, but we suspected for years that he uses them to launder money for the Sinaloa cartel. Marcus picked up one of the photos, and Daniels works for him. As a spotter, Ramirez confirmed. Daniels identifies actual drug mules coming through O'Hare, but instead of arresting them all, he selects his targets carefully. The ones connected to rival organizations get arrested with planted evidence to ensure convictions. And the ones working for Reyes? Marcus asked. They get a friendly warning and directions to bypass normal customs channels. According to Reed, there's a whole network of corrupt officials working at the airport. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the full picture becoming clear. So my detention wasn't random. Daniels must have recognized me from somewhere, thought I was competition. Exactly, Ramirez nodded. And the false FBI agent who tried to take custody of you? We think that was Reyes's cleaner, someone who steps in when problems arise. Phillips pushed forward another photo showing the man who had claimed to be Special Agent Wilson. His real name is Michael Conti. Former CIA operations officer, now works private security. Specializes in making problems disappear. So what do we do? Marcus asked. Daniels is in custody, but if we move too quickly, Reyes and the others will scatter. Ramirez smiled for the first time. That's where your unfortunate detention becomes our greatest asset. As far as Reyes knows, Daniels is still holding you, still trying to figure out who you work for. You want me to go back undercover, Marcus realized. As myself, but not myself. Precisely, Phillips said. We release you on a technicality, but make it look like the case is still active. Daniels gets quietly released too. We'll claim insufficient evidence for now. Then Daniels reports back to Reyes that I'm still a threat, but one they can monitor, Marcus continued, seeing the strategy. And I become the bait. Ramirez nodded. It's risky, but this might be our best chance to bring down not just Daniels, but the entire airport operation and possibly Reyes himself. A knock at the door interrupted them. A junior agent entered with a tablet. Sir, we got the security footage from the airport. You need to see this. The footage showed Daniels searching Marcus's bag, the moment when he slipped the drugs inside clearly visible from one angle. But more importantly, it showed Daniels taking a phone call just before approaching Marcus initially. He was tipped off, Phillips said. Someone told him to target you specifically. Marcus stared at the screen, a chill running down his spine. That means someone recognized me. Someone knows I'm DEA. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Their operation had a leak, and Marcus had walked right into a trap designed not just to frame a random black traveler, but to specifically target a federal agent who might have gotten too close to something bigger. This changes things, Ramirez said finally. We're not just dealing with a corrupt cop and his cartel friends. There's someone on the inside feeding them information. Marcus stood up, determination replacing his earlier anger. Then we need to give them something to feed. Something that leads all of them right into our hands. The other agents looked at him with newfound respect. What had started as a humiliating detention was transforming into potentially the biggest operation of their careers. And Marcus, who had been the victim, was now positioned to become the architect of its success. 2 days later, Marcus sat alone at a small table in the corner of O'Brien's, a bar popular with airport staff and local police officers. He nursed a beer, keeping his eyes on the entrance while pretending to watch the baseball game on the TV above the bar. The DEA had arranged for his release on a technicality that morning, with news of the dismissal purposely leaked to Daniels through Officer Reed, who was now working as their inside man. The door opened, and Marcus tensed slightly as Officer Daniels walked in. Daniels spotted Marcus immediately, his eyes narrowing with surprise and anger. Just as planned, Daniels believed Marcus had been released due to a procedural error, not because of his DEA status. Daniels made his way to the bar, ordered a whiskey, and pulled out his phone. Marcus watched in the mirror behind the bar as Daniels sent a text message. Within minutes, the door opened again, and Michael Conti, the man who had posed as an FBI agent, entered the bar. The trap was set. In the parking lot outside, Ramirez and Phillips sat in an unmarked van, monitoring the audio from the small microphone hidden in Marcus's watch. 3 other DEA teams were positioned around the area, ready to move when needed. Inside, Daniels and Conti huddled in conversation at the bar, occasionally glancing in Marcus's direction. Finally, Conti stood up and approached Marcus's table. "Mind if I join you?" he asked smoothly. Marcus gestured to the empty chair. "Free country." Conti sat down, his expensive suit contrasting with the casual atmosphere of the bar. "Marcus Johnson, you've had quite a few days, haven't you?" "You could say that," Marcus replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Being framed for drug possession tends to ruin a man's week." Conti smiled thinly. "Strong accusation. Officer Daniels has an excellent record." "I know what happened," Marcus said firmly. "What I don't know is why." Conti studied him for a moment. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding, one that could still be cleared up, with the right cooperation. "I'm listening." "My employer has extensive business interests. Legitimate businesses that sometimes require special consulting." Conti leaned forward. "Your background in Colombian imports is of particular interest to us." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You seem to know a lot about me." "We make it our business to know everything about people who might impact our operations," Conti replied. "Like the fact that you spent 18 months in Bogota, or that you have connections to certain distribution networks. Marcus kept his face carefully blank. Conti was fishing, trying to confirm suspicions without revealing too much. And what exactly would this consulting involve? Advisory services, helping us understand shipping patterns, customs procedures. Conti took a sip of his drink. The compensation would be substantial. More importantly, your legal troubles would permanently disappear. Marcus pretended to consider the offer. And if I'm not interested? Conti's friendly demeanor hardened slightly. Those drugs in your bag, they could easily reappear. Next time, no technicality will save you. The door to the bar opened again, and a tall, distinguished-looking man entered, Victor Reyes himself. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline. The cartel's Chicago representative rarely exposed himself like this. They must be very interested in him indeed. Reyes nodded to Daniels at the bar, then walked directly to Marcus's table. Conti stood respectfully as Reyes took his seat. "Mr. Johnson," Reyes said, his voice carrying a slight accent, "I apologize for Mr. Conti's bluntness. When we identify talent, we sometimes forget our manners." Marcus nodded cautiously. "No offense taken. I understand you've had an unpleasant experience with our city's police." Reyes shot a glance at Daniels. "Rest assured, that was a misunderstanding. In fact, I'd like to offer you a job." "What kind of job?" "The kind that makes use of your unique knowledge of Colombian export procedures." Reyes smiled. "The kind that pays $50,000 per consultation." Marcus whistled softly. "That's generous." "We value expertise," Reyes replied. "All we ask is discretion and loyalty." Marcus took a long drink from his beer, giving the surveillance team time to record everything. Then he leaned forward. "When do I start?" Reyes seemed pleased. "Tonight. I have a shipment arriving at O'Hare at midnight. I'd value your assessment of our current procedures." As they discussed details, Marcus knew they had them. A direct invitation to observe a drug shipment from Reyes himself, with Daniels and Conti as witnesses. It was more than they had hoped for. Outside in the van, Ramirez smiled as he listened to the conversation. "Got you," he whispered. The trap hadn't just been set. It had been sprung perfectly. Midnight at O'Hare International Airport. The usual bustle of the main terminals had quieted, but in the cargo area, activity continued under the harsh glow of floodlights. Marcus stood beside Reyes and Conti near a private hangar. "Colombian coffee beans," Reyes explained with a smile. "A legitimate business that provides additional benefits." Marcus nodded, appearing impressed. "Smart. Coffee beans absorb the scent of cocaine, making it harder for drug dogs to detect." Reyes looked pleased. "You do know your business, Mr. Johnson." Daniels arrived in his police cruiser, parking near the hangar. He approached the group, now dressed in plain clothes rather than his uniform. "Security cameras are on a loop," he reported to Reyes. "Customs officials have been taken care of. We have 30 minutes. Marcus glanced at his watch, the signal to the DEA team surrounding the airport that the operation was in progress. Ramirez and 20 agents were in position, waiting for Marcus's final confirmation that the drugs were present. The cargo door of the plane opened, and workers began unloading large burlap sacks. Reyes led Marcus toward the plane. "I want you to verify the quality," Reyes said. "Your experience in Colombia makes you uniquely qualified." Inside the cargo hold, Reyes directed a worker to open one of the sacks. The man cut it open, revealing coffee beans. He dug deeper and pulled out a vacuum-sealed package of white powder. "Pure cocaine," Reyes said proudly. 94% purity, worth about $15 million on the streets. Marcus examined the package carefully, then squeezed his watch. The final signal. "Impressive operation. How many shipments like this do you bring in?" "2 per month," Reyes replied. "Daniels ensures our shipments pass through without inspection. Other officers handle different airports. Chicago, New York, Miami. We have people everywhere." "And the competition?" Marcus asked. Reyes laughed. "That's where Daniels truly earns his pay. Anyone not working with us gets arrested. It's convenient having law enforcement eliminate your rivals." Suddenly, bright lights flooded the hangar as vehicles screeched to a halt outside. Ramirez's voice boomed through a megaphone. "DEA, nobody move. You're surrounded. Reyes's face contorted with rage and confusion. He turned to Marcus, realization dawning in his eyes. You. Before he could finish, Marcus grabbed Reyes's arm and twisted it behind his back. Victor Reyes, you're under arrest for drug trafficking, conspiracy, and about a dozen other federal charges. Daniels pulled his gun, but froze when he found himself surrounded by DEA agents. Conti tried to run but was tackled by Phillips before he could reach the door. As Ramirez entered the hangar, Marcus handed Reyes over to another agent and approached his boss with a satisfied smile. 18 months undercover in Colombia, and we finally got them, Ramirez said, surveying the scene as agents secured the cocaine and arrested the workers. It wasn't just Reyes, Marcus added. We've got evidence against 7 police officers, 3 customs officials, and airport security personnel. A whole network. Daniels, now handcuffed, stared at Marcus with hatred. You're DEA? Impossible. We checked you out. Marcus approached Daniels, standing tall before the man who had humiliated him days earlier. That's the problem with racial profiling, Officer Daniels. You see a black man coming from Colombia and assume drug dealer. Never occurred to you I might be federal law enforcement. This isn't overt, Daniels spat. Actually, it is, said a new voice. Officer Reed walked into the hangar, accompanied by Sandra Reeves, Marcus's former lawyer. We have your entire history of false arrests, Officer Daniels. Every person you framed, every piece of evidence you planted. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the back of a crowded courtroom as the judge delivered his verdict. Daniels was sentenced to 20 years for corruption, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Reyes received life without parole. The entire network, 16 people in total, faced similar sentences. Outside the courthouse, Ramirez handed Marcus a folder. New assignment. Your choice after what you've been through. Marcus thought about all the innocent people who had been framed by Daniels. People who, unlike him, didn't have a DEA badge to protect them. I want to stay in Chicago, Marcus decided. There's more work to be done here. More corrupt officers to find. More systems to fix. Ramirez nodded with understanding. The department's lucky to have you. As Marcus walked down the courthouse steps, he passed families of Daniels' previous victims, many of them black and Latino men who had been exonerated as a result of the investigation. One man stepped forward and extended his hand. Thank you, he said simply. No one believed us. No one listened. Marcus shook his hand firmly. They're listening now.